Welcome to the Suicide Monk, and I'm your host, and my name is Britton. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Adam Dell. He is board certified in clinical psychology. He served in the military as a psychologist. He has firsthand experience with suicide. He was a first responder and EMT overseas, and has some incredible stories and in close proximity with suicide in and of itself, and then throughout his practice has had this. He is also currently employed by the University of Notre Dame in their mental health department. So just welcome him, sit back and enjoy this. This is a lot of great information that he brings to the table, theories and professional practice and firsthand experience. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll see you on the flip side. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? Give me some of your background. I've introduced you. I did a pre-introduction.
Sure.
So
my name is Adam Dell. I'm married. I've been married 17 years. We've got two biological daughters, ages 9 months and 4 years old. I met my wife in a graduate counseling program in Indiana. And then shortly thereafter, I got my doctoral degree, doctor of psychology degree. Once I finished that, I was in the Air Force for almost 7 years as an active duty psychologist. And for the last 4 years or so, we've been back here in the Midwest. I work at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm the director of emotional well-being there for a clinic on campus that offers therapy to faculty and staff, like folks in the athletics department, or really anyone that works for the institution that supports the institution.
Nice. Do you deal with a lot of athletes there?
I deal with a lot of coaches there. Yeah. So if
a lot of coaches. Okay.
Yeah. So if you're in the athletics department and in coaching, strength and conditioning, NCAA compliance, any kind of like role like that, you'd be eligible for therapy services with our team. Okay.
And is that primary? What does that entail? I mean, you don't have to go into details, but what is kind of the program for? And the reason I ask this because I'm actually meeting with an athlete, professional athlete that is in the mental health field now, or at least trying to help people in the mental health field.
Yeah.
Or with mental health problems, I should say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, I think whether I was in the Air Force or I work in a place like the University of Notre Dame, one of the salient things that these organizations have taught me is that even the best of people are people at best. And there's a faculty member, author, speaker named Susan David at Harvard University. And she's got a pretty popular talk online where she says something like, stress and grief is the cost of admission to a meaningful life in this world.
Oh, wow.
And so, like from in a place like the University of Notre Dame, right, from faculty to the food line, right, from people who are priests to people that work in landscaping on campus, from deans to the dish room, people have broken hearts. And episodes of psychiatric distress, whether that's trauma and stressor-related symptoms, status post, some sort of traumatic life event, or episodic depression or anxiety, these things are ubiquitous phenomena in culture. And so, it's my role there, similar to in the United States Air Force, was really to help sharpen the human operating system so that people can continue to flourish and do well. Not only just by driving down or ameliorating suffering, but also hopefully by walking people in the direction of flourishing, building a meaningful life.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's great. And how long were you in the military? You were Air Force?
Yeah, I was almost up to 7 years. Yeah.
Okay. And so you're from the Midwest area, right? Is that
I
correct?
did
Or
all my like higher ed was here. I grew up
okay,
in
cool.
Pennsylvania. Yep. Yep.
Oh, okay. Very nice. Very nice. What part of Pennsylvania?
Lancaster County. Yeah,
Okay.
my nearest neighbors were Amish there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My first
Yeah.
job,
So,
man, was harvesting tobacco in the summers on an Amish farm, which I can assure you is way more difficult than being a psychologist.
oh my
Like,
gosh. Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I just watched an interview with a disavowed Amish. I don't know if that's probably the correct word, but um,
Excommunicated or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it was interesting
Huh.
to hear that because you know in the northern part of Indiana where it's Amish also. I mean it's
Yeah.
very Amish
Totally.
oriented
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Mennonite and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So it's interesting. We don't honestly we don't have a lot of information on their lifestyle.
Yeah.
Um, even being from the Midwest. I mean obviously you can read books and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
just in general they don't communicate with the outside world very often
Yeah.
um, unless you show up at their business.
Right.
So yeah, it's very hard to get involved in how they function and what their struggles might be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, that's great. You had mentioned something, and I can't remember the other day when we talked. It it had some it was some type of psychology that you were. I don't have it here. I thought I had it written down. I'm sorry.
Slap
Um,
therapy or
well, it might be sad. That's what I've always gotten. That's what mom always treated me with.
he's like, I got something very therapeutic, Paul.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like therapy that I offer. Or,
Yeah, just you had mentioned some type of psychology behind the suicidal ideology and
yeah,
thought.
yeah. Well, so when I was an officer in the Air Force, suicide and alcohol related issues and sexual assault were like these three things that were high target items for every command team because uh, the optics are horrible and it really eroded unit morale. And so, as a subject matter expert from a behavioral health field, as a psychologist, commanders would oftentimes come to me and say, you know, what can we do by way of prevention to mitigate the likelihood that these outcomes continue?
Right.
Which, that was the first time in my young career that I realized just how difficult prevention is. Because, like, if you do prevention well, the thing that you're trying to prevent doesn't happen. And
Right.
then if what you're trying to prevent has a really low base rate, like suicide, not suicide attempts, but actually death by suicide, the base rate of that is really low, even in an organization where you'd expect it to be rather high. The most likely person to die by suicide in our country is Caucasian male. And that is by far the most common demographic in the Department of Defense. So you would almost
And that's at a
expect,
certain age, right?
yeah, well, you would expect a white male between 20 and 50 to be the most likely candidate to die by suicide. Not the most likely
Okay.
to attempt suicide. Women far outpace men in terms of suicide attempts. But
Right.
men tend to outpace females 3 times over in terms of actually dying by suicide. And the explanatory factor in that is that typically males will die by suicide via firearm. They're so much more likely to use a firearm. And so you've got this like mostly white male population, all of whom have been trained to use and many of whom actually carry firearms. And it's like, we need you to reduce, this in this population. And so, you and I talked in the pre-show a little bit about suicide, something that's deeply affected my family. I've had multiple family members die by suicide, and I've seen the ravages of that on those that survived it. And then as a psychologist, I've lost people to suicide. I've been on the phone with people when they committed suicide in crisis centers. Like hearing the gun go off, the thud of a body and the phone hitting the floor, somebody bursting into the room and hyperventilating. And I've certainly been proximate to units where, service members of various rank and influence stare down their own life instinct and didn't flinch. And then I've been one of the first guys to show up to the units to look at everybody in the eyeballs and try to figure out what in the world you say. So I got really interested in learning as much as I could during my military career about various theories associated with suicide. And thanks to taxpayer dollars, many healthcare professionals and certainly mental health professionals in the Department of Defense are able to get just world-class training in things. So getting trained in evidence-based interventions in clinical settings like the collaborative assessment management of suicide protocols of CAMS is something that's used pretty widely. If somebody's in your office and they've identified that they have thoughts of suicide. But one of the things that you and I talked about was actually Joyner's model, his interpersonal theory of suicide. I don't know if it'd be helpful to talk about that, but
yeah, let's talk about that, because I did write that down. I don't know why I don't have it. That's why I must have wrote it somewhere else.
Yeah. So I mean, honestly,
that's what I think you had mentioned. So yeah,
there were things inside of this model. In fact, I was reading books on Joyner's theory in 2016 while I was deployed in the Middle East, shortly after a really grotesque suicide had occurred that just really shook up, a lot of the service members that I was deployed with. A young female hung herself. And so, everybody responds to that differently. It's a traumatic event. Those that knew her well were quite shaken. And so, the command team out there, they said, we need you to start, giving lectures across the base so that we can better understand as leaders how and why suicide occurs and what in the world we can do to prevent it. And so I started reading Joyner's book. Like one of them is just called The Interpersonal Theory of Suicide by him. Another one, which I think is probably most approachable for a non-clinical audience, is his book titled Myths About Suicide. And, like any good academician, I think he starts to define the construct of suicide by sort of defining what it's not. And so he talks a lot about how suicide is not an impulsive thing. Suicide is not a selfish thing. Suicide.
That's interesting.
Suicide's not something that happens while most suicides don't occur when people are like wildly intoxicated. So he starts going through at the first end of his book about maybe popular myths about how people try to frame this thing that has existed for a long time. In his books, Myth About Suicide, he talks about how humans are not the only species that intentionally will end their life. He goes through so many other mammals and fish and reptiles and other species that, especially in late spring, which is when humans tend to have the biggest surge in suicide behavior, will intentionally end their life for one reason or another. And then his interpersonal theory basically helps us to understand, and it is theory, but I'll tell you, on the basis of 20 years of clinical work with people in psychiatric hospital settings, crisis hotline settings, outpatient clinical settings, it certainly lays on nicely with what I've seen over and over and over again, that people typically want to die by suicide for one of two reasons. And his labels for that are thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. And so when there's been an enormous rupture in belonging, I mentioned earlier, like it's typically a male, middle-aged, that is the most likely candidate to die by suicide in America. And the likelihood that person has just had a tearing away of a professional or personal relationship, especially like access to children or in a marriage, is extremely
Yeah.
We are social creatures, and to have a fundamental rupture in belonging leaves us enormously vulnerable. Perceived burdensomeness is partly why Joyner says that in the mind of a suicidal person, suicide is not a selfish thing. Uh, Mentally ill or distorted as it might be, in the mind of most people who truly intend to end their lives via suicide, they've come to believe that it's actually the most loving thing that they can do for others or for the world. And,
That's true.
I've had the opportunity to read and be proximate to suicide letters that were left behind by individuals, or psychological autopsies that were done in the Department of Defense after a suicide would occur, where there'd be interviews of family and friends and looking at, what was left behind on the computer and whatever. This is also why elderly people, disabled people, or people with severe disability and chronic pain will die by suicide at higher rates, because it's like, I don't want to be a burden to those that love me. I don't want them to see me suffer. I don't want them to have to take this on, or I've caused them enough pain. I don't want to continue to perpetuate that. Now, in almost every case, loved ones would say, no, 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 no. Like it's an incalculable, privilege for us to help care for you. But in the mind of a suicidal person, one of Joyner's kind of phrases for this is a perversion of virtue. He wrote a book called Perversion of Virtue, which is more aligned with murder suicide, which only occurs in about 3% of all suicides, where someone will take someone else's life and then take their own. But it's like this idea associated with mercy or justice or something like that gets perverted. So those are the two big drivers. And I can share with you like a visual graphic of this, because it's really easy to make sense of if you see it. So you've got like thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness is why people desire to die by suicide. Then there's this other construct which he refers to as capability. And you and I talked about this a little bit. It's like, to stare down your own life instinct and not flinch is actually one of the most fearsome, arguably the most fearsome behavior anyone could ever do. Like we are literally, before we can use language, and even when we're unconscious, our bodies are literally wired for survival. You could have a major blood loss injury, be totally unconscious, and your body is sending platelets and doing everything that it can, shunting blood to, core organs. Even if you're not conscious of it, our bodies are wired to survive. So to stare that down, not to glorify it, but it is a fearsome, act of human behavior. And every single person on the planet has a different capability to actually do that. And according to his theory, and this is actually, in every other approach to suicidology that I'm aware of, there are lots of things that increase people's capability. Prior suicide attempts is definitely one of them, but also exposure to horrific things. Surgeons, for example, have high rates of suicide, which on the surface makes no sense, because a surgeon gets paid an obscene amount of money, has tons of authority, is really bright, very accomplished. Like most surgeons that I know have far better hairlines than I do, and perfect looking spouses, and a set of perfect children, and a different BMW each year, and they die by suicide via scalpels at higher rates than you might imagine. And it's psychiatrists have very high rates of suicide. It's like exposure to human suffering or blood and guts increases capability. Veterans have high rates of capabilities high, such that if that desire piece ever coalesces with capability, you've got a really high risk kind of scenario there. And so, long story short, I don't mean to just keep going on and on and on.
No, keep going. This is interesting stuff. Please.
When I would go out to these units, right, I'm looking in the eyeballs of a unit, some of whom are horrified. It's like, my gunnery sergeant just ate his own gun. And like, since I've been in the Marine Corps, that guy has been my idol. And then there's like colleagues of that guy that are like, we had no idea that
Mm-hmm.
there was anything going on. And then there's other leaders in the room that are like, I'm going to lose my job because this happened on my watch. And then there's a percentage of people in the room that are like, I didn't know them, and it's a tragedy, but like I'm not terribly affected by it, you know.
Hmm.
And these guys are like, well, what are we supposed to do as a unit? Because some of us are really hurting, and a lot of us are somewhere in between hurting and unaffected. And so taking Joyner's model at a population health kind of perspective, I oftentimes would talk to a unit about the relevancy of promoting belongingness and dispelling burdensomeness as cultural theme songs for what the unit was going to be about. So, in my experience, especially in settings like that, it wasn't the God Squad, you know, chaplain guys. It wasn't, you know, the creepy stigmatized mental health dudes that were going to really provide that kind of belongingness. It was, you know, look to the person on your left and your right, ask them if they're sleeping, when they last ate, what they need, when's the last time they touched base with somebody they loved from home. Promote belongingness within this unit and dispel burdensomeness by making sure everybody's got something that everybody else is counting on them for.
So
Because,
community.
yeah, community and purpose, right? So it's like, this is one of the reasons, interestingly, I mean, you can see this writ large across the epidemiological data in suicide research. So women with no children are much more likely to die by suicide than women that have children and are responsible for caregiving for those children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, there's probably, you know, many complex explanatory frameworks to understand that, but at least one of them certainly must be that if I have multiple individuals in my life who love me and desperately need me, then I've got a lot of protective factors, you know, in my life. So something that keeps me here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's amazing. Everything you've said except for the murder suicide part, I relate to from my side of it.
That's a
Like
relief.
all
You
that.
don't relate to the murder suicide part.
Yeah, no, no, that's
Yeah,
not my gig.
especially
That's
dudes with
definitely
blue
not my gig.
turtlenecks.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, definitely don't want to hurt anybody. That's not my goal. My
well,
goal, and even in this whole thing, is to help save lives, and
yeah, but isn't
hopefully
that?
people don't.
I'd love to hear more about that from you because it's like you don't want to hurt anybody, and yet you know what it is. At least you've shared a little bit with me. You know what it is to
Yeah.
get to a place where you think I'm going to end my life, and I
I
think
mean, it was there last night. I was there last night. I mean, it just, anger, frustration, rage, it will take over sometimes, even with nothing. I mean, right now I'm just exhausted from working so much, but it just builds, and then the littlest thing sets you in a path emotionally and mentally to say I'm just can't keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and nothing ever seems to change, even with a lot of effort.
yeah,
Which I'll be talking about that here soon. But yeah,
perfect. Yeah, I just think like
and
what a quintessential example. And I would say too, you know, my wife oftentimes chides me because I'll talk to her about like how cruel and insufferable the world seems. And she'll be like, well, yeah, because all you ever do is talk to people about their suffering, you know, like you're sort of a
right,
weird person. And I don't know, maybe there's some validity to that. But what I would say is that um, thoughts that I or the world might be better off if I wasn't here are about the most common symptom that anyone has ever endorsed with me behind a therapist's door for 20 years.
right,
That it's like one of the 9 symptoms of depression. Um, and I think like sometimes like one of the privileges of you, you know, taking a risk and saying like, hey, you know, blue turtleneck or not, would you be willing to come talk, you know, on this podcast for a little bit? Is like some of your audience maybe has never spent this much time having the opportunity to kind of lean in with a psychologist or a mental health
right.
clinician. And there may
Right.
even be this idea that, well, yeah, but I mean, there's a darkness to my thoughts that, if I were to go there, they would surely think that I was an insane person or immediately lock me
Yes.
up. But the
Yep.
reality is that, especially among people that come in for counseling, it's over half of those. For example, if you have depression, any form of it, mild, moderate, severe, 50% or more people with depression diagnosis have had suicidal thoughts in the last year. And so it's actually probably a lot more normative uh, than someone might imagine if they just kind of are within their own kind of realm of suffering.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's interesting to me that how many people I talk to just on a regular basis are in the midst of a struggle.
Yep.
Like almost everybody. I hand business cards out to so many people, and I'll bet you it's 75% of the people I talk to easily.
Yeah.
And they've all had suicidal thought. So they can all relate. Like I feel like I'm putting myself out there, but really I'm not. People are just afraid to talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you give them space to do that, they'll open right up.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to hear people's stories as I walk through this new journey of mine and hear how many people do suffer with this.
Yeah. I think like vulnerability begets vulnerability. It's something that a supervisor
Hmm.
of mine shared, and we live in a world where I think people will be in droves drawn to a podcast like this, and in part, what I hope it does is normalize and validate that all of us can speak, the language of lament. I heard one of your podcasts. I just had a chance to listen to a few of them in preparation for this one, and you were I thought perspicacious in identifying that there really is no good sense in sort of measuring my suffering compared to somebody else's,
Right.
because like
Absolutely.
pain is pain, and uh and I think the language of lament is universally spoken. And so in as much as people might hear something like this and have their own kind of suffering normalized and validated, what I hope it also will do, and I imagine what will increasingly happen for you, and I actually worry about you a little bit in this regard, is because you have done the courageous and vulnerable thing in sharing part of your story, you will become a target for a lot of other stories. And I don't say I worry for you in that regard, because I don't think that you could be helpful or useful, but rather just because I think you could easily become inundated with more stories than any one person could meaningfully offer time to and response to. Um,
Right. Yep.
and and so I hope individuals who, like, I would encourage you, like I would anyone in a similar circumstance, to kind of have a revolving door policy with individuals, where it's sort of like, reach out to me, and if somebody gets in touch with me, terrific, and then let me kind of nudge you in the direction of somebody that
Right.
can be a longer term source of support for you, in part because that might be the most benevolent thing for them, but also just to kind of make sure that you're still sleeping sometimes and not totally consumed with vicarious traumatization and secondary traumatic stress, with legions of desperate, broken people who say, I have a story as well.
Well, that's a good point because it's something that I do. I'm navigating well right now,
Yeah.
but I'm not talking to people. I am talking to people every day, but I'm not interviewing on such an intimate level all the time.
Yeah.
But so someone like yourself, you're talking to people on a regular basis,
Well,
clients. So my question for you would be, how do you navigate that? What is your regimented health for taking care of yourself?
yeah. Well, I think I shared with you that one of the seminal reasons why I left the Air Force was actually a suicide. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there was someone I knew, uh, who I had actually interacted with, you know, fairly close to his suicide. I was a medic in the Air Force, and so a non-combatant. And obviously, you know, my 4-year-old would tell you that I'm a feelings doctor. But I mean, I was trained to do battlefield medical type stuff. You know, that's historically what medics do in the Department of Defense.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
there was a night that I was on call, and we responded to the barracks and found him having, you know, fairly recently hung himself. Wrapped arms around his still warm body, you know, cut him down, tried to bring him back and couldn't. There was something about that and having a daughter shortly thereafter our first child. It's like I crossed a line of, I don't know psychologically that I could do this again. Or if I did, I don't know that I would want to find out what version of me would be left. You know, like trauma exposure has a cumulative effect over time. And so it's not really a matter of if, but when that will catch up to somebody in ways that are really harmful. And when I got back from that deployment, I was drinking really heavily. I found that if I drank 10 to 15 shots at night, I wouldn't have any nightmares about finding him. And there were very vivid smells and sights and things I heard associated with that, as well as just enormous, like, just cacophony of shame and guilt and grief that, like, I had just had dinner with this guy recently. And he would have had every opportunity at that time to be like, I'm really struggling. And I just felt like I missed it, you know? So, you know, I think there's been these kind of seminal turns in my career when I've decided, like, for the sake of my own psychological well-being, I need to not work for this population anymore. I need to take a break from this kind of clinical work. But honestly, man, I mean, I think Kristen Neff is someone who's written a lot about self-compassion. And when I would talk about that construct with Marines, or really men in general, there's usually like these ideas in their heads of like something enormously effeminate, you know, like bubble baths and scented candles or something like that. That's not at all like what is. In fact, I think that your podcast, in some ways for you and for some that hear it, may be a great example of self-compassion. So there's three components of self-compassion. The first is mindfulness, and I'm happy to circle back around and unpack any of these if you'd like. Mindfulness being, I am increasingly, intentionally, volitionally connected to something here and now in a way that I can be more aware of and participative with it. So that could happen in a Buddhist way when you're, you know, just focused on the breath and your eyes are closed. It could happen when I'm eating a bowl of ice cream and I'm actually experiencing the flavors instead of just engulfing it. It could happen when I'm jumping on a trampoline with my 4-year-old and I'm just noticing like the weightlessness being up in the sound of her giggle. It's like being more connected to the here and the now in a way that I can be curious and with it. Mindfulness, connecting my pain to something universal. I think we already talked about that a little bit. You know, it's like my pain doesn't isolate me from the herd. There's something uniquely and universally human about lament and suffering. And the third component is connecting with the same kindness and wisdom that I would have for someone I really cared for, but for me. And so, you know, like over and over and over again in my career, one of my initial supervisors, a psychologist, when I was in my doc program, killed himself. And there was a time that if you had researched his name on any internet search, you would have seen him on local news channels talking about suicide prevention in the month of September. This guy was a brilliant clinician, a super athlete, a pillar in the community. And in the context of ruptured belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, like he killed himself.
Wow.
And I see this with fighter pilot, when I was in the military with the pilot community. I see it all across and up and down the organization in a place like Notre Dame. People can be extraordinary in their field, but just so deteriorated. And like they could even be in a position where they're leading, supporting, helping everybody else. But simultaneously, they have an alcohol use disorder that's running totally out of control. And like what they're telling other people is not congruous with like how they're living their life. And so
Right.
to be honest with you, man, like the way I stay in this is I only do clinical services 4 days a week. And during my 3-day weekends or times away, I do self-compassionate things. So I'm connected to the here and the now and play with my kids. Nutritional psychiatry is something that has become increasingly important to me in recent years. I've lost 60 pounds in the last year
Oh,
because
wow.
I'm trying to apply like kindness and self-control and wisdom to what I'm putting into my body, so I'm not like elbow deep in a can of Pringles with my, second gin and tonic every Friday night. Um,
Right.
there's a fascinating book I read this year from Anna Lemke called Dopamine Nation. And, in that book, she talks a lot about how we are constantly doing this dance of seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and it walks us in the direction of these compulsive addictive behaviors.
Oh, wow.
And so anyway, like my pillars are sleep, nutritional biochemistry, exercise, and connection that really promote emotional well-being.
Yeah, it sounds like staying in the moment too, staying in the day is a lot of that. I know that's been a lot for me.
There's something about that, right? Like over the years that I've been a psychologist, I'm increasingly drawn to acceptance-oriented therapy. Acceptance, not now that's like a dirty word in American culture.
All right.
So I don't
Right.
mean like acceptance, like tolerance or resignation. And I certainly don't mean some
Mm.
sort of bullshit form of Pollyanna, whatever, where it's like, this is bad, but I'll tell myself it's good. Like there's some, I sometimes like I'll go to conferences with mental health professionals. I almost need to be physically restrained from assaulting people when they are talking about what they say to others.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
my go-to in therapy is just telling people like, look in the mirror and just tell yourself that you're like a really great person. Just keep saying that. And it's like the clinical literature has been done on that sort of thing. And the suicidal person actually becomes more suicidal when they do that. So this like acceptance isn't like I'm just totally terrific, like I'm basically perfect. In fact, I'm a narcissist. It's like it's not that,
Right.
but it
Right.
is like it's like somebody who is taking an acceptance posture to life. It's almost like there's a switch in our heart that says yes or no. And if I'm not willing to accept life as it is, my switch is on no. It's like I can't be with this reality, with this part of me, with these thoughts and emotions, with this stuckness, with this brokenness. I can't. And what that oftentimes walks you in the direction of is avoidance. And I would argue that
Right.
for at least some people, suicide is like the ultimate trump card of avoidance. It's like,
Hmm.
I cannot be here with this anymore. If you
Right.
flip the switch to yes, it's not saying that I like this shit. It's not saying that I think it's good. It's not saying that this is the story that I would author for my life or for my family, but it's saying I can be with this as it is. And I get to find the and of like, and I still have some choices and I can still find gratitude in this thing. And there's still opportunities for connection. This is what Viktor Frankl wrote about, a Holocaust survivor. liberated from a Nazi death camp in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, when he says, between a stimulus and my response, there's a space. And in that space lies my freedom. And in that freedom, my ability to choose and even to choose happiness. It's like, I don't know how much more credibility you could have in terms of having something to say about human suffering than being liberated from a
Right.
Nazi death camp, but it's like,
Yeah, for
when
sure.
I can be with this as it is, I don't need it to change. And it's like I lean into that space. And there's something liberating about finding the and in that way, like finding that space.
Huh. I'm going to kind of circle back around here a little bit and touch on it. It's, for me, I found it's really difficult. Even when I have good information, it's really difficult for me to enter into that space
Yeah.
because I'm consumed by the suffering in my own head. It's hard to apply even the things that I've learned today. Even, I talk about resting in faith a lot. I do the work, I show up, and then I have no control of the outcome, which helps me a ton. I'm not trying to force anything. I'm not trying to do anything, but there's this element where even in resting in faith, I'm worried. I'm worried. I'm like the rug is going to get pulled. But there's like really no community around me to to encourage or support, or especially in this nature of a business that I'm doing right now with suicide. There's not. Even some of my closest friends have a really hard. Well, they know what my direction is, so it's very hard for them to enter into a conversation or to walk alongside me. So as I've felt alone in life, period, I feel very alone still, even though I'm entering into a community of people that I understand, um, because it still becomes very, very difficult because now I'm absorbing somebody else's story
Yeah.
and putting it on top of mine, and
Yeah.
trying to filter that out of my life in a healthy way, that I don't forget what they're going through, but in a way that it doesn't bring me to the floor. Um, I'm not sure where I was going with that. I'm sorry.
What do
But I
you
do find
mean by resting in faith? What does that mean?
so like, you know, growing up around the church and in the church, it's like you pray and you have faith. God's going to answer your prayers. Well, in my experience, God doesn't answer prayers. That's my experience. Um, Whatever I've prayed for, I have been just beaten to the ground at every turn. Every time I've tried to change my perspective, it gets rerouted back to the same thing. Every book I've read uh, can has changed my life in a certain way, but I still end up back at the beginning, and that's kind of what's happened. It's not the reason I'm able to talk about this now is because it's a logical thing for me. Like I look at the logic, I look at the evidence, and I say, okay, this is the reality. This is what I've done. This is where I'm at. And what I've done has not been an addition to making life better for myself or for anybody else. And the evidence wholeheartedly speaks to that for the most part. Now, and this goes back to not recognizing somebody's suffering. You were kind of saying about the guy you're
Yeah.
in the military,
Yeah.
the reason you left. I don't know that people meeting me now would know that if I didn't talk about it, they wouldn't know. They would have no idea. And I'm just bold enough to say I don't care what anybody thinks anymore, because it's not about me anymore. It's
Yeah.
about helping other people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is about me. I am trying to save my own life and save others. That I will tell you that at this point in my journey, does it look like it's gonna come to fruition and I get to stay on this planet? It's not looking that way, but there's this. That's where I rest in faith. I'm going to show up. I'm going to do the work. I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and then I'm going to rest and say, this is now. I've done everything I can possibly do, and now I'm just going to rest and be okay with the outcome.
Yeah.
And that keeps me out of the past, and it keeps me out of the future.
Okay. Is there,
So that's what I mean when I rest in faith.
yeah, is there something that, is there an idea in your mind about how you would know if you were doing enough to justify continuing to live?
Um, I mean, this is the only purpose I've ever had.
Okay.
Having, there's this element, you have kids, you have purpose, and I had that purpose. That purpose is over. I missed out on most of my children's growing up, and now I'm missing out on my grandkids because of the nature of who I am and my anger, and my kids don't really care for me that much. Well, I shouldn't say that. They don't like me very much because of the the anger and the frustration. And it's not anger directed towards them. It's anger at life, and I can turn a room blue in a heartbeat just with walking into it. So I got to be real careful about how I enter into public now. And I'm very conscious of it. Um, so I don't know, with this purpose. This is the only thing that I've ever done that has been really like outside of me,
I see.
because as a suicidal person, or in that thought process, your navel gaze a lot, and you miss out on a lot.
Yeah.
So now I'm not navel gazing. Um, I'm out there in the world, and I'm trying to help people, and I mean, it's done wonders for me. But do I still have the same thought processes? For
Yeah.
sure I do.
Yeah.
Um,
How far back
yeah,
did you go in your story to, like, what's the origin of these? That the idea of, like, maybe it'd be better if I just wasn't alive, or maybe I should hurt or kill myself. We talking like tiny guy? Or,
yeah. So when I was 5, I realized that this is not the way the world was supposed to be. Like, something was missing. I was feeling detached, or disassociated. Don't have much memory after that. I have a few memories during my childhood, but a lot of sexual abuse, from what I understand. I remember one event, and then based on certain things throughout my life, I'm like, okay, that was probably reoccurring.
mm,
I just don't have any recollection of it. So that really came to fruition. Uh, I was broken by 10, like I was shattered by 10. By 12, I was starting to experiment with how to take my life. And so it's been a plague I mean, I'll spend weeks, months barely being able to move, and just severely depressed. And
yeah.
I could take pills. That's all great and fun and fine, but I don't like being numb. So I did that for two stints of 3 years, taking different depression medications, and eventually I took myself off of both medications because I got tired of not feeling anything.
Yeah.
I'd rather feel something than nothing, and I wasn't because I wasn't feeling anything. I wasn't able to process anything. It's like I just feel numb.
You just
So
blunt.
how do
Yeah.
you think through?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Actually, kind of a weird question.
sure.
Do you remember, like, on the basis of a picture, um, or just personal recollection, like roughly what you looked like when you were 10, 11, or 12? Like, you
Oh,
don't have to.
I
Yeah.
have one image of.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious, like, if you can bring that to mind, like
Yeah,
what
when I
your
was
hair looked
10.
like, what your clothes looked
Yep.
like what, kind of, I don't know, that would have been like roughly fourth, fifth grade, something like that. Um,
Yeah.
one of the things that, this is something very personal for me. You and I both have childhood sexual abuse in our histories.
Mm,
And one of the most common after effects, males and females, after that kind of childhood adversity, is a pervasive, darkened sense of self, world, future, relationships, God.
yep.
And also just an enormous sense of shame. Um,
Yes. Yep.
And so, like a lot of times as a clinician, I'm in my office with somebody who has that kind of hell in their history. And like one of the things that I just think I've literally seen it in front of me in a therapy room in real time, or people have thought about something like this and come back in later. But one of the things inside of acceptance and commitment therapy that I think is profound is various forms of perspective taking. And, I'm
On self.
yeah. So I'm a clinician. So anytime I hear somebody's story, I can't totally take that hat off. And I know that we're not here
Right.
doing therapy,
Right.
uh,
That
but
was my fear coming into this.
yeah. Well, I mean, and that would actually be like wildly unethical for me to do that, but I just, like, I only know bits and pieces of your story from what you've shared of the podcasts I've heard, but I'm just thinking like whatever that scrawny 10, 11-year-old kid looked like and was trying to make sense of, like making sense of senseless circumstances and trying to find purpose in the midst of something which seemed like a lot of putrefying pain. Like we're the kind of monkeys that always long for coherence. That's why
Right.
like if I showed you a Rorschach plot and I said, what might this be? You would immediately start seeing like butterflies and penises, and like these are common responses to those. The only logical response, bro, is an ink blot. But like we're constantly projecting stories and meaning and coherence to even totally innocuous things like that.
Yeah.
And so what's fascinating to me is like sometimes when I think about a person through the various contexts of their life, like 10 and 11-year-old, like sometimes a clue for people in finding self-compassion, like the kindness and the wisdom that they'd have for themselves, is sitting down for 15 minutes and being like, I want to write down the letter that I would want to give to that young kid. And it might start with something like, I just want you to know, or I don't want you to forget, or regardless of what the world has shown you, or it's really important that you da 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 da. That's one way to do it. But another way that I think is even more profound is like, if you flip that whole idea around and somehow through some magic portal, and if I had one of these, Notre Dame should pay me a lot more, but I don't have a magic portal. But if through some kind of magic portal, 10-year-old you could see you now on this podcast here in this moment, and he knew that he was going to grow up to be you, that his life was going to be your life, what would you want him to see? Not what do you think he would see, because then we get really judgmental towards ourselves and we start, like our younger self is like, you fuck up, whatever. But it's like,
Right.
what would you want him to see about what you're doing right now? And I don't mean to put you on the spot and make you say that. If you choose to, you can. But I think one of the things that's really profound about right now is there's this man that I'm talking to who's still got breaths in his lungs, it beats in his heart, who's endeavored to do something so bizarre and courageous that people in droves are signing up just to be proximate to it, all on the basis of, I want to continue to live and help others to do the same thing. And I don't know what 10-year-old you would have said, I want to be this when I grow up, But if it had something to do with telling the truth, living by that kind of integrity and doing courageous things in service to other people, even in a broken and a difficult world, that it's like, well, then I can be here in this moment right now. Because that stuff is here. Like the pain is here. Yep. My history, is my history. There's no such thing in cognitive science as unlearning. Like the world has broken me in a number of different ways. And yet, like what I get to find in this space right now is worth showing up to. And
Yeah.
it's like, I'd want him to see that, like I'd want my 10-year-old self to see that I have some things to offer to others, that I try to do some good, that sometimes I do brave things, that I drive a 2,000-pound piece of machinery called a car, and I like wear these clothes, and that, it's like there's some aspect of our 10-year-old self that would just be wide-eyed, like, wow, look at my beard, looks really good. It's like, holy, what happened to my hair? Or it's like,
Yeah.
looking at you and say, like, I got my own show, and there's how many thousand people who want to listen to what I say? And I don't say that to puff you up or be like, look, everything's great, but just to say that, like, if you were to consider yourself in the various contexts of your life, sometimes it provides a window into sort of like self-compassion and values that is hard to come up with if you're just kind of like sitting and thinking about right now.
I as you're talking about this, I wouldn't recognize me as
Well,
like the 10-year-old boy. He was broke. I mean, he's just gone.
yeah.
What I realized, because I always accounted who I was to my anger. That's who I was. That's what I was. I was this dirty, evil, disgusting man that threw these big temper tantrums, and it frightened people.
Yep.
And that's how I always viewed myself. But what I realized just in the last probably year, probably 2 years, as I look at my son, he's been broken in certain ways. And so we relate really well together, and I'm able to relate my stories with some of his stories, and we're able to have those conversations. I would never want to have these conversations with my son, for him to be broken, to have those conversations. That I don't like. I do relish in the fact that we are able to have deep, intimate conversations. But what I realized through all these intimate conversations with him is that I was once a sweet boy, just like he was. He, this will get me. He was such a nice, beautiful kid. I mean, he was just so sweet, and that was taken from him. And what I realized, that was taken from me too. And I was probably this really nice, sweet boy. And by the time I hit 10, I had no identity. I started watching people to learn behavior when I was, whenever you enter into school. I remember standing on the playground, staring out at everybody and just watching behavior, what was acceptable, what was unacceptable, what you do to act and react. And then, you add my trauma on top of that, and then I couldn't control any of some of my reactions because they were outbursts in rage. And that's when they really, really began and were embedded in me at a young age. So trying to get away from that in my older age has been very difficult. And I just thought I was always an evil, bad person. And what I realized is that was just taken from me. And that if I was nurtured in a different way, I'd be a much different man. But that brings us to the question, would I change anything about what happened to me today? And the answer is no. So, and I say that because I wouldn't have the courage, the guts, the fortitude, the acceptance to be able to sit with people in their horrific ways. And I wouldn't be able to look at people in the same way. Like, I'm very judgmental, but once I realized that everybody had a story, it took all my judgment away.
Yeah.
Not all of it, but 99% of it.
Yeah.
And I still have those judgments. I still have those initial thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah.
But what I do now, how I approach people is, everybody's got a story, and I need to figure out how to make their day.
Yeah.
Like, because I have a lot of social anxiety. So I think people look at me I think I'm stared at. I think I'm very uncomfortable in social situations. But now I don't have that problem because everybody's got something to teach me. The most beautiful to the most ugly, they have something to teach me. And I don't mean that in a physicality way. I'm just saying with the person that they are.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how you can diffuse somebody just by asking how they're doing. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah. Boy,
Unbelievable.
beautiful to hear you talk about like how sort of like the coalescence of how some of your sweet innocence was harmed. You think about how trauma or pain has entered into your son's life as well. Yeah, we all have a story, right? Like we all at one point, right? We're just like this big, and
Right.
some giants in our lives looked into our eyes and said, "Hey, uh, you can study that even in a neurobiological way now. You make eye contact with a little infant, and they're just like dumping endorphins to be touched and to be seen, and all of global news, basically puts its attention on things like a little kid that falls down a well or a baby that gets stolen, or it's like entire cities will shut down because there is like this incalculable worth that's imputed on tiny life. And it's such a rare and beautiful thing that any one of us exists.
Oh, I know.
I don't know that we really think about that often enough, like how truly rare and quixotic it is that any one of us exists.
It's unbelievable if you really start to think about it. And you're one in 2 million sperm to reach the egg. You're the winner. You get to experience this. You get to go through the hardship, the suffering, the ability to become something more or better, or you can choose the other way and become something very, very difficult and worse.
Well, and I think that that's a really interesting thing that you point out too, that it's like both of those things exist in the human condition. So I think sometimes, and depending on what kind of attachment someone has in their young life, like if I could tell you a quick story about my 4-year-old kid, I took her to, I took my family to the beach over Christmas. And so we're out in the sand and building sand castles. And my daughter's name is Addie. And there's some older kids that were proximate to us, and she wanted to go play with them. So I said, sure, go for it. And she went over and interacted with them, and they basically said, we're not interested in playing with you. And I could hear this. So she comes back and tells me what happened. And it's like, well, sweetheart, those kids just don't want to play. She's insistent that she wants to go back over. I hear her go back over a second time, and she's making a case like an attorney would. It's like, first of all, I have friends at preschool. Also, I like Bluey. I have a little sister. I think she literally told them I have yellow hair, and they're like not impressed. So she comes back.
Really?
She comes back the second time, and it's like, sweetheart, listen. For me, it's like, oh my God, girls in particular engage in so much more relational violence than boys do.
Yeah.
She's going to be marginalized, ostracized, bullied. Like, pray to God she keeps her mom's looks and not mine, so there's less to pick on, whatever. But she's insistent I want to go back a second time. And I said, honey, like sometimes kids just don't want to play. I'm going back. I hear my kid go back there, and she says to them, my dad loves me all the way up to the moon and all the way back, as like her final card to lay down. Like, now you should be able to accept me because he says that I'm that damn important. And you know what their response was? Like, who cares? Like, get out of here, So my daughter comes back though, and right before lunch at the beach, we go to this, not very expensive place on around the holidays. Anyway, we call it popsicle o'clock because we go grab a popsicle at like the 7-Eleven on the way back to the place that we rent. And, she's like totally chipper. And she's like, I told him that you loved me so much. And I guess they just don't want to play, but it's popsicle o'clock, and like she's 4 and she's more kind of befuddled by it than hurt, but it really got me thinking, like, what I belong to, who I belong to in a time of incomprehensible betrayal or loss or pain might make a difference in like what trajectory I take next, like who I am affiliated to and where I belong, who loves me and where that worth and identity is connected to can be enormously saving. So like that, there's that one aspect of it. And I think like the psychology of religion and positive religious coping and affiliation to healthy attachments with humans, like that's really important. But the other thing that exists is that we are all kind of wretched, like I've never met anyone who was truly exclusively the victim of their circumstance. Like, if you're older than 2, you are also at least in part the architect of some of your misery. Now, I would never say that to someone that's like, I just got sexually assaulted. And it's like, you're the architect of that. But it's like how I've chosen to cope with something like that, the choices that I've made. And this is where, I think like whatever people might make of Christ and his teaching, his most famous message is probably the Sermon on the Mount. It's studied in universities, and it starts with, truly fulfilled will you be when you realize how spiritually bankrupt you are. Now, that's not like a very American thing. Like, that's not a billboard-worthy sentiment,
That is not.
But once again, it's like, as a psychologist, lament is universal, but also like I'm not good enough, I'm profoundly broken, I'm unlovable, I'm dirty, I'm shameful. That story, those stories that we tell ourselves, is about the most universal thing that I ever see. And what I think is amazing is it's sort of like what somebody does next with that, who they go to that, or what trajectory they take, largely determines whether they walk in the pathway of something that looks like post-traumatic growth or triumph or opportunity, or like unbelievable despair. It's like, if we can recognize that there's something pervasively broken inside of us, and like who we belong to or where we go with that brokenness says a great deal. And I hope that your podcast, I hope that for you, for me, for my kid, for your kids, for anybody that's listening to this, it's like, if I can resonate with the fact that deep down there's something terribly wrong with me, then it's really important for me to start asking the question, like, what does that tell me that I care about, and where do I go with that pain or that bankruptcy? And again, this is where I think, at least in my clinical practice, I've seen like the saving nature of deep attachments with people or with some kind of higher power as being really critical for a lot of individuals. It's like, if I run to the end of my resources, then like, well, then what?
Well, I actually experienced that very same thing today, because last night I'm pissed off. I'm like, fuck you, God, fuck you, devil. I don't want to exist. And today I'm having a hard time entering back into my relationship with God, because I'm like, well, I just told him to fuck off. And but a lot of my filtering is done through that. Like how I maintain and manage the darkness of other people's stories and my own darkness, like we were talking about earlier. That's how I do that. And that's part of resting in faith for me also, is that I'll carry it for a certain distance, and then I have to give it up to my God. I mean, I just have to. Um, or it just sits with me and it weighs me down, and then I'm incapable of doing anything, and then even self-care becomes really, really difficult. So I got to be real careful about how I navigate those things, especially being alone most of the time. Um, what was the other? You'd said something. Oh, leaning into the pain. It's most, and this we'll go back to basically the beginning of what we started talking about is most people don't know how to lean into the pain. They instead avoid it, and that you kind of touched on that earlier, is that avoidance. And leaning into it doesn't mean necessarily accepting your pain. It just means embracing it and trying to figure out how to navigate what you're going through, um, in a healthy way. And
Like,
that's a very
yeah,
difficult thing to do.
yeah, I would say any mental health professional worth their salt will eventually help people to understand the cost of avoidance. Like we all engage in avoidance, and some of it
Yeah.
is absolutely survival oriented. You know, like
Yes.
my kid touches a stove, they're going to recoil from that, avoid it because they don't want to get burned anymore. Um,
Right.
I think like one of the things that's really interesting about very painful thoughts or emotions, though, is that the more intensely I try to avoid them, it becomes a self-amplifying loop, like the louder that they become. So,
Yeah.
for example, if I happen to have really dark thoughts, this very recently, I met with a woman that has some peripartum anxiety and depression, and like people can develop really profound psychiatric symptoms largely, as a consequence of physiological processes. Their thyroid is terrible. They have an
Yeah.
undiagnosed sleep disorder. The potassium is weird. They just had a baby, Uh, and yeah, so I mean, like very regularly, and I've heard many women talk about this, she'll have these like vivid, intrusive thoughts about like taking that child by the ankles and swinging it around and just smashing its head on the corner of a table,
Yeah.
or like taking
Yeah.
it upstairs and just like throwing it like a frisbee out the second story window.
Yeah.
And like individuals would be horrified by these things. They'd come in to talk to a mental health professional. It's like, oh my God, I can't get this out of my head. It's like, what did did you do something to hurt your child? It's like, no, I could never do that. And one of the things that's like fascinating to me about obsessive, ruminative, intrusive, like violent, hostile thoughts like that. And I think for some people, they experience suicidal thoughts like that. It always goes after the thing that you care about the most. Like
Interesting.
your obsession will always go after the thing. Like she's not having those intrusive thoughts about someone on the other side of the world doing that to their baby. She's
Right.
having those thoughts about somebody doing that to her baby. And I think
Yeah.
like again, like if you think about like that dual kind of incalculable worth, how rare and beautiful it is to even be alive, matched on with like the profound brokenness that accompanies the human experience, is like that's where the coalescence of those occurs. I think at least for some people with recurrent suicidal ideation, it's like to live, to love, to make a difference, to listen to music, to dance, to orgasm, to eat something delicious, to offer something charitable and generative to other people. Most of us would say, that's just a life, man. Like, I'm down with that, And when I
Mm-hmm.
make an impact on someone else, or when I've fallen in love, or when I've shared something that was objectively good, when I've taken part in something bigger than myself that was objectively beautiful, it's like, oh God, I'm alive. But then also, I think some of the really intrusive thoughts that will get flipped, and it's like that's where suicidal ideation comes in. And the harder somebody says, like, "Oh my God, I can't think like that," like the more intense, it just becomes like self-amplifying. You're just like thrashing around in quicksand at that point. And so like one of the things that from more third generation cognitive therapy that individuals will basically try on is it's kind of like, imagine that you're in a car and you're driving, and these types of thoughts are like an obnoxious and very loud, sometimes backseat driver that's like, turn left, turn right, slow down, speed up, you're an idiot, stop. And it's like, that chatter comes with me on the ride, ultimately, like from an agency standpoint, like my full, whole conscious adult self, like I'm driving this thing. But like that becomes data, but it doesn't have to be a directive. And that's an easier thing to write about in a textbook than it is to do very well on a night of quiet desperation. I get that. But I just think like it's worth saying it, right? Because it just seems like it's related to kind of where we've meandered in the conversation here, that like it very well could be that the deepest hurts we've ever had, whether it's self-directed violence or it's painful grief, anxiety, depression, it very well could be that the deeper the hurt is, the more of a signpost it is to significance in my heart about what matters. And if it is a signpost, right, and it's like, I'm hurting bad, like blinding pain, something's going on, what does that tell me that I care about? Like if that hypothesis is valid, then this is connected to something that matters. I'll only obsess about the things that matter. I'll only hurt where I care. And if I can find that place of care or conviction, then the next thing that I do, say, or be about can flow from that. That's why I mentioned to you, like, your podcast is at least in part transforming pain into purpose. And it doesn't take away your history, and it doesn't even take away the pain, but it adds something else in, like it folds something else into your experience. It's more like a freshwater phenomenon.
Yeah, and the fold is more, what's being folded in is more important or more profound than the pain.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, and maybe you're
which creates change
because of the pain. Right? It's like,
say that again.
It's like in some ways, man, you're qualified by the pain to be in this position.
Yeah.
And that
I'm an expert, I think.
Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to keep upping the ante in terms of pain.
Right.
So tune in next episode.
No, I've had enough. I'm good.
You know, it's like I wouldn't, but it is kind of like, yeah, I mean, as human beings, we would be so presumptuous and ostentatious to ever assume that we could exactly know what another human being experienced. I remember my wife and I were foster parents for 10 years, and we had all kinds of kids come through our house. And I used to be just shocked. I mean, truly shocked. You'd get a sibling group of kids come into your home, genetically about as close as human beings could possibly get, having been raised in the same freaking environment. And they're all telling me totally different stories about what they experienced right before they came in. Totally different personality types for each of their parents. I would see this with Marines. They'd get blown up in some deployment, like some mission that they were on. All of them are in the same area of responsibility. All of them under the same. They're all telling me totally different versions of what happened out there. So it's like, you could be right next to somebody in the middle of the darkest night of your soul, and the meaning that you're making out of that Rorschach is just totally different. Like the personal responsibility you're assigning, what you're thinking about God, how you're making sense of it, what you want to do next, you know, all of that stuff. So you could never exactly know what another person's going through. But I think from a place of vulnerability and from our own wounds, right? It's like, that in some ways, I think if we can recognize that brokenness and bankruptcy in us, it does afford us the opportunity to potentially move forward in a generative direction, assuming, I hope, that we're not putting the weight of the world only on ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Yep. There's this other thing that I realize that I'm walking in contradiction consistently walking in contradiction right now. And part of that is, I'm walking towards my own demise while trying to save other people. So that's one of the big contradictions. People don't really understand that, but there's this element. It's not just about other people. It's also about me trying to save my own existence. But I had no idea this was going to come about and be this profound in my life. But I couldn't get here without that detrimental or that demise well, of wanting to go, you know, ending up to a place in my life where I wanted to go take it. Um, I don't know if you know this, but I've planned my suicide 3 times. This is my fourth time. The fear of the fourth time is that most things come in fours for me, uh, generally good or bad. And I've been told there's biblical significance to that. I have no idea. I don't know. I'm not that well versed, but it's so there's this element to me that wonders if this is a permanent um, road that I'm on. I don't know. Um, and I put things in place to where I ensured that I could, because I knew my mind would bounce, but I knew that I would be back in the depression at some point. So I ensured my path in a certain manner that I can't really get out of other than a miracle. That's the other thing I realized, that most most people who are suicidal that I've met are intelligent, very intelligent. Um, and I say that because they generally see, and I don't know that this is a good view, but they see the demise of the world. They see the darkness in the world, and they can't reconcile what they see with the goodness that is in the world, because what we've experienced is mostly darkness. So we see mostly darkness. So that becomes a very nihilistic path for people like me. And you don't really see the light until you start leaning into the suffering and realizing the value of the suffering. And that's why I wouldn't change anything that I've gone through if I'm on a path to help at least one person live,
Yep.
um, even being myself. So what that one person, everything else beyond myself of being saved, I feel like is a bonus round. I feel like we're anything beyond my initial
Well,
trajectory and hope is, if somebody else benefits, I'm in the bonus round. I get to experience something that I never got to experience before in my life, and that's somebody else living through their pain because of my pain. Does that make sense?
yeah. Well, I mean, it's a hell of a why. There's that. There's an idea, I think, written through philosophy and every wisdom tradition that, like, joy and suffering are inextricably linked. And Khalil Gibran is a poet that comes to mind. You wrote beautifully about this. He wrote a poem called "On Joy and Suffering." That they're like that. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more room there is for joy to fill in. Where the same well from which you draw buckets of laughter was once filled with your tears. And
Yes.
I mean, you've done you've put yourself into kind of an ethical dilemma, I think, in
Yes.
terms of
Yep.
I believe everything you just said, right? I believe that there are times that, even as recent as last night or the last 24 hours, that you've had thoughts of, I should take my life. I also believe that, connected to some values and convictions in your heart, you would like to tune other people's hearts to brave music, like flood their path with light, like give them a
Mm-hmm.
sense of a future where the skies are not so dark and threatening. And
Absolutely.
and so now you've got 9,000 people watching you on something like this. And so like this only keeps happening if you're around for it.
Right. Yeah.
And honestly, if that's the why for right now, you know, like that old idea of like a person who has a why can bear almost any how. If this is a why for now, in terms of there's people that I haven't met and perhaps won't until whatever might be on the other side of this life, if there even is such a thing, you know, like individuals who I may not actually personally encounter until we're both lost in a perpetual contemplation of infinite glory on the other side of this world, whatever that is.
Right.
Who are buoyed by this at this time. That's a heck of a why, you know?
Yep.
Now, I would also say that like that generativity can be enormously purpose oriented, but by far like the biggest predictor of life satisfaction or human flourishing is relational connectedness. That comes from the University of Pennsylvania, Martin Seligman's group. Like relationships, a couple of deep relationships, all the way back to Aristotle and some of the ethics that he wrote for his own son. It's like even more important than marriage is a couple of really good friends, deep, deep, deep friends. And so I think that that's going to be a necessary component for almost anyone that isn't like profoundly, profoundly autistic or intellectually disabled, like to share one's life with at least one or two deep friends. And then also to have some kind of work that is connected to meaning or purpose where I can see accomplishments, you know, like, I don't know how you measure accomplishments in something like this. I don't know. I've not had a podcast,
I don't know.
you know, but it's like, whether it's the number of people who are generating interest and tuning in, or it's the stories that you hear, like, I don't know about you. I've got a very small kind of footprint in Instagram or places like that. And every once in a while, I'll get a DM from someone that's like, I was in the middle of a really dark moment, and for some reason, some goddamn algorithm sent this video to me. And
Yeah.
and it really just, it was like a light bulb kind of like tripping over the truth moment of insight for me. And it set me off on a slightly different path, and I wanted to thank you for that. And in my worldview, Dr. Joyner, Interpersonal Theory for Suicide guy, he's got this one story in his book that I share a lot in audiences that I do lectures in, or something I think about a lot. It's something I even thought about before I connected to the platform today. There is a kid that jumped to his death from the Golden Gate Bridge. And if you do that, it's about as lethal as a gunshot wound to the head. And so you got a 98% chance of dying. And he did. And so the Coast Guard pulled him out. They identified who he was. They go back to his apartment, and he had left a note there, which was just, riddled with thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness type themes. But at the end of the note, he said something like, I'm going to walk to the bridge today, and if a single person smiles at me on the way, I won't jump. And, I don't know what happened on that day. Like maybe a dozen people smiled at him, and he still jumped off the bridge. And I wouldn't share that with you or anyone to be like, we ought to just walk around with goofy grins on our face trying to save people from themselves at the grocery store or whatever. But what I would say, man, is that like maybe we shouldn't underestimate the power of simple acts of charity towards people who are walking to bridges, for people who are walking to bridges that we don't know anything about.
Well, I would say that should apply to anytime you're in public. Make eye contact, say hi, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, how are you doing? It's really easy to make friends if you make an effort. And it's really easy to change somebody's day.
And like, what if you and I, as human beings, decided that like, if that was one of the highest callings in our lives, to in general offer charity to a lot of people, and maybe for a couple of them to offer a tiny bit more than that. I mean, in my estimation, dude, that is a higher life's purpose or calling than I could have ever deserved. Because again, if I'm aligned with that like bankruptcy broken part of me, that little broken kid that I was had no business growing up to being in a moment like this where he can say, you know, I've actually seen this be really helpful for people. And to your point, if there's a single person that is still listening to this 90 minutes in and hasn't found this to be a terrific cure for insomnia or something, it's like and they caught any bit of it, what you just shared there, something that I've shared, and it's like I'm gonna like safeguard that like a gem in a sacred shoebox that I keep inside of my heart, and it's gonna help me the next time that I'm facing something dark. It's like that's really special, you know, to be.
Yeah. No, see, I'm very intentional about when I leave the house now. I don't leave the house if I'm in a position where I can't change my attitude to positive for somebody else. If I can't do that, I'm not leaving the house, because I'm no good to anybody, and definitely no good to myself. I usually get myself in a situation where people can feel what's going on with me, or my expression, my body language, whatever, and it will inevitably cause them to treat me in an ill manner, no matter if I've said anything or not. And I've discovered that my demeanor has a big play on how I approach people.
Yeah.
And I don't let other people affect my trajectory now. Like, I'm sorry you're in a bad mood, but, can I give you a hug? I gave a lady a hug the other day. She was like, drove up, said, "Hey, are you guys got any good food? I'm sitting outside of a taco stand." And she thought I worked there. I was like, "Yeah, we got great food." She's like, I was like, "What do you want?" She's like, "I don't know." I was like, "Well, I'll buy you a couple tacos." So and she goes, "Well, do you work here?" I was like, "No." So I bought her some tacos, and we were just chatting it up, and eventually she's like, "What do you do?" Well, me being me, I tell her what I do. She's like, "You know what? I just had all these things happen to me."
Yeah.
Loss after loss after loss after loss. I was like, "I'm really sorry to hear that." So I gave her my card, and I was like, "Can I give you a hug?" I was like, that's way out of my realm of like being nice to people, of go hug people. I'm just not. I mean, I'm just not who I am. But I'm allowing myself space.
Yeah.
What's that?
I think that's a beautiful example of how we can disobey our minds.
Yes.
That's another term from acceptance and commitment therapy that just changed my life. Like part of the reason why I lost 60 pounds in the last year is I started disobeying my mind when I had all these rules about when I ate or the types of foods that I ate. It's like my whole life I ate dinner because I told myself I always eat dinner. And it's like, well, what if I just didn't do that? I didn't even know anything about intermittent fasting or whatever, but it's like the first day they did that, it felt like the whole universe was upside down. Or it's like somebody who's really introverted who's like, I'm going to go to this place that's crowded and I'm going to initiate 3 conversations with people like I'm a flaming extrovert just because I can,
Right.
or even people that are really, really, trapped in psychiatric distress. Like if you came to Notre Dame, there's a huge prevalence of OCD in a place like Notre Dame because really brilliant people are perfectionists and obsessed. And then they self-select into academia where they can write perfect papers and pilot perfect research projects and run perfect programs and have a perfect lab and all that kind of stuff. And so if you followed a bunch of faculty around Notre Dame, especially during the COVID years, when they were losing it over germs and viruses and stuff on handles of doors and stuff, if they had come to see me and they were doing what they were supposed to do, you would watch them touch a door handle into the bathroom and lick their finger to disobey their mind. I was like, I just got jerked in my hands and I need to wash them 75 times, It's like, It's like, and we do this with people with depression too. It's like, what does depression do? Well, depression, at least to some extent, is violence turned inward and usually patterns of withdrawal and isolation. And so, like, the last thing that somebody who's really depressed wants to do is go to the gym or call somebody and initiate a conversation, or even preposterously, right? Like, buy somebody a taco and tell them a joke, or like call somebody up and tell them three hilarious things that happened to them in the last year. But it's like,
Yeah.
if you force yourself to do that, you actually realize that, well, there's my agency. Like, there's that space again between a stimulus and my response, and I can lean into the and there. The other thing your story reminded me of is I learned this years ago, but South Africa is a nation that has been ravaged by the traumas of apartheid and racial inequities, and
Mm-hmm.
their
Yes.
greeting of the day in South Africa is sawubona, which I'm sure I'm not saying with appropriate enunciation. But rather than that being like, what's up, or how you doing, potato chip, or whatever we say here in America, good morning, that actually literally translated. And I think it's profound considering the brokenness that has been in that culture and society. That literally means, I see you, and in seeing you, I bring you into being.
Huh.
Like, that's
That's pretty incredible. Yeah.
a hell of a good morning.
That is.
And that's what you're
Yeah.
endeavoring to do, right? And it's not as if you can do that for everyone all the time. But I
Right.
oftentimes think like
Yep.
that kind of small act of intentional mindfulness based charity of like, I see you, and in seeing you, I bring you into being. Like, you're worthy of attention. Your story matters. I'm connected to you. I actually
Mm-hmm.
give a shit about what you say next after I say how you do it. Well, I mean, that kind of thing is so human and unmistakably healing that it's not therapy, but it's perhaps more therapeutic than therapy could ever hope to be.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. The other thing I encourage people to do, especially now, that I talk to, is talking to a microphone. You want therapy? Listen to how you talk to yourself. Listen to what you say.
Yeah.
Listen to what your thoughts are on a recording. Go back and listen to who you are and how you perceive the world, because that will change your perception on who you are and how you perceive the world. And I never knew that till I got in front of this thing,
Oh,
which was really
what did you
interesting to me
learn? What did you learn?
about myself.
Okay.
Oh man, I've learned so much. Well, and that's one of the things. Like, once I started listening to my frustration, like, I'll do it even when I'm angry. I mean, I'll cuss and get pissed and get angry. Like, I was even getting yelly today, and I'm like, okay, when you start hearing yourself, you start changing who you are. Because I have this little theory of mine that I've worked on for several years now. Not several, probably 5 years, maybe 3, is I accepted myself. And it was about 5 years ago. I accepted who I was. I was like, okay, if my God accepts me for all this debaucherous shit that I am, I like sex, I like drugs, I like liquor, I like all these different things, pornography, whatever. When I accepted myself, then I was able to step back away from myself and say, well, is that really good for me? Is that productive for me? Is that who I want to be? Is that what I want to look like to myself? And what happened was, well, pornography peeled off. I was like, what? Didn't even try. Didn't even try. I just knew I didn't like the objectification of women. I didn't like how the whole gamut of what it represents. And then you got sex trafficking behind that, and then child trafficking. So all these things started to enter into my process of, is porn worth it for you, Britain? And the answer became no. Do I desire it once in a while? For sure.
Yeah.
But do I trick myself into letting myself do that? Absolutely not. It's not worth it. So even smoking, alcohol, everything is on the table for me. And it doesn't mean it's going to change overnight, but it does mean I'm continually looking at who I am behind those mirrors.
Yeah.
And that's important to me. I never had that ability before. And that's when I found joy. I found joy in my life,
Yeah.
through a lot of therapy and stuff like that, and reading, and uh, a lot of that stuff peeled away, and joy entered in my life,
Yeah.
and the suicidal thoughts reduced.
Yeah.
It went from 75% depression and suicide to 25% suicide and depression,
Yeah.
and that's where it's been for 6 years now.
Uh,
The problem is that I didn't have a lot of suicidal ideology over the last 6 years until this last 2023, where a lot was lost, and um, logic entered. And I mean, just an absolute, if I told you everything that I lost in 2023, you'd be like, yeah, I get it. I mean,
um,
my dad died, two friends died, lost 8 friendships. Yeah, it was horrific. And
yeah.
then, my grandkids aren't part of my life anymore. And my 2 daughters don't like me. But and my son wasn't talking to me at the time. But here's the miraculous thing: my son came back. We're talking again after 2.5 years, which is wonderful. Because I thought our relationship was done.
Yeah.
Um, but these things. Well, I don't know where I was going to go with that, but just leaning into all that has allowed me to do something that I never thought I could do,
Yeah.
and be something that I didn't even think I was worthy of doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that would be sitting in front of this and talking to people.
When you think about like the role that porn, cigarettes, liquor, were those all just forms of avoidance for you? Like,
Oh,
were
yeah,
there
for
like
sure.
a certain degree of escapism in that? Or
Oh, yeah, for
yeah,
sure. So, well, when you're sexually abused, generally masturbation starts at a younger age.
totally.
And
That was me.
in what's that?
Yeah, that was true for me as well. Yep.
Yeah. So, and in that, you develop a lot of shame out of that also.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's no navigation for you, because you don't want to tell anybody, and there's nobody to talk to you about it. So it created for me this long-term disgust for myself sexually, in any act. And then you add religion on top of that. Wow. That's a lot of detriment, and that's a lot of proof that you're not worthy,
Okay.
um,
Yeah.
per se.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. I just think like we live in a culture where we're basically cacti in a rainforest. Like we're built for scarcity, but we're surrounded by so much opportunity for hedonic, dopaminergic, addictive patterns of
yeah,
behavior, and we're also like running away from pain. And so that kind of an environment means that we just get completely flooded with substances and screens and sexual
mm,
things and all these, basically habits that are avoidance and pleasure oriented, but the more we do them, the less effective they are. And in fact, the more painful
oh yeah,
our lives
yep,
become. That it is a remarkable thing, like in pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, how miserable we get. And if you can just stop pursuing all those pleasurable avoidance strategies, as you just described, you find like you get clean from that. You feel like you can live again. Like
yes,
you're not living this kind of
yep,
mindless autopilot, which honestly I think would walk almost anyone in the direction of despair and suicidality.
yep,
Like
it
our
does.
culture as it's currently constituted, if you put any other generation into this, I think would have a very eerily similar dramatic escalation in neuroticism, like depression and anxiety and suicide and addiction. And like we're just not built for this neurobiologically. Um,
Right,
to
right,
live such boring and sedentary lives surrounded by so many screens, so easily able through substances that can be procured or purchased to just like escape down these holes and at great personal health and relational detriment. Yeah.
yes, yep, absolutely. Yeah.
So I mean, I
Well, let
think
me
like
ask you.
that's amazing just to hear part of your story about um, your willingness to turn from some of that, which had become more than just like a habit, but almost like probably a part of your identity. You know, like at some point, you're not somebody who's
Yeah.
trying smoking; you're a smoker. You know, or like
Right.
at some
Right.
point, you're not somebody who casually looked at porn once. You're like a porn addict, or you're not a drink
Right.
somebody who drinks every once in a while. You're an alcoholic. And there was a disobeying your mind component to all of that, I'm sure, where it's like, I don't need to keep telling myself the story that I need this. And it walked you in
Yeah.
a pathway of liberation and ultimately joy. It's just beautiful.
Yeah. And, I'm not totally free from any of those,
Yeah.
not all of the, I'm not totally free from all of those things that I
Mhm.
use, like I still smoke weed, and I still drink. Those but they're also avoidance for me. My mind never shuts up. The
Yeah.
monkeys never stop jumping. I have to calm them down. I have to sedate
Uh,
them a lot of
okay.
times. But the counter to that is the sedation method
Yeah.
adds to it.
Yeah.
Alcohol's a depressant.
Oh, man.
Weed
Yeah.
does. Yeah, weed
Every,
does help me think through, but
I
you know,
was just going to say, like, every weekend, I work at a psychiatric facility here in the Midwest. And every weekend, I meet a new collection of people from Michigan, Illinois, or Indiana who had their life's only psychotic break in the context of smoking marijuana. Like
really,
the potency of cannabis at dispensaries now
yeah,
is so high, anything
yeah,
over 10% is considered just absurdly high. And in what average is in dispensaries is like 12 to 15. You get
yeah,
wax or something like that, you might as well just like pray for, you might as well just be counting on becoming paranoid and psychotic. But it's
yes,
astounding to me. Like, I've worked there for 3 years, probably hundreds of people over those 3 years. I've met hundreds of them who no other psychiatric history whatsoever, their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And, they use marijuana or eat too many edibles and get really psychotic and try to kill themselves, or get really psychotic, get naked and go masturbate in Walmart or something. And
right, right,
it's like, it's never happened to this person before. And so I always just, I'm not the weed police or anything. But I always just try to talk to people a little bit about like, if you have a genetic vulnerability to psychiatric issues like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, spectrum, bipolar disorder, etc., we know unequivocally that marijuana or cannabis use will exacerbate it. And whether it pushes you over the edge to like total altered mental status or not, can't really predict unless it's unbelievably potent. But even things like sleep architecture. And the reason this is top of mind for me is like, if I took a normally functioning person with almost no trauma history and no history of depression, da, 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 and I just started deteriorating only their sleep and everything else stayed the same, right? They still had a great hairline, great life, whatever.
hmm
They would develop psychiatric symptoms so darn quick that you would have a hard time differentiating them from somebody that has had them lifelong. Like people who have deteriorated sleep alone could develop unbelievable major depressive disorder symptoms and also have all kinds of physiological problems with their libido, their ability to concentrate, executive functioning, all of it. And like cannabis is one of those sneaky things that, if I binge drink with alcohol, as I certainly have playing a history with, that messes up my sleep for that night. But the next night, if I don't drink, my sleep architecture, my stages of sleep is fine. If I use
okay,
cannabis for 4 days thereafter, 4 nights thereafter, my sleep architecture is totally jacked up, which means that if I smoke on a Wednesday, even on Saturday night, likely I'm not going to be getting restorative sleep. And it's like, well, what's the consequence of that? Well,
wow,
manifold, but like certainly one of those things would be an absolute intensification of psychiatric symptomatology.
yeah.
Uh,
You know what? So we're talking about last night.
Mhm.
Um, I realized. yesterday or the day before that I'm I'm just exhausted, like mentally exhausted. Working 12, 14-hour days almost every day for the last 4 months.
Wow.
Had a little bit of a break during Christmas, but
No.
especially since I've been back, I've barely come up for air. The other day I walked outside and realized it was 70 degrees. I had no idea. So last night I was in a position or a place mentally that I have actually never been before. And that was to this psychotic in an anger that I've never ever felt before. And I felt a lot of anger and a lot of rage, but this was different. This was like, it was almost impulsive. It was the first time I really felt impulsive about wanting to take my life. And which I thought was really interesting to me because I think about it a lot, but to just be impulsive is not who I am. I'm gonna facilitate this in a way that it's going to be the least amount of damage possible for everybody else. That's my thought. It's not maybe a good thought, but that's my thought. And that means being alone by myself, away, not to be found, not to be discovered by a child, or, I'm not going to be abrupt in any way. And last night was the first time, but I realized that I think that's a sleep detriment. It's not because I'm not in a good place. I'm actually doing something that I love. Been looking forward to this interview all week, and like I'm in a good headspace, but with the lack of sleep and not allowing restoration at this point has created a monster.
Well, and I used to work in a sleep disorders clinic, and it would be hard to overstate how difficult that is. Like a book that's been really helpful to me in the last year, is published last year, is Peter Attia's book Outlive. And he's got a whole chapter on sleep as well as exercise and nutrition. That really was the catalyst for me to start just getting better sleep, eating a lot cleaner, exercising. I mean, like, I didn't only lose 60 pounds because I stopped eating dinner, but
right.
I think part of, we talked a little bit about self-compassion earlier, and it's like kindness and wisdom I'd have for somebody else. That's really freaking hard to manifest in my own head or in my emotional life. Like, could you imagine how weird it would be? Or at least for me, it would be very hard to look in a mirror and be like, okay, Adam, think kind, wise thoughts about yourself and feel that.
Right.
I'd be like, what the hell is this? I was like, I can't follow my brow. I'll be like, kindness and wisdom, But my life could definitely display it, like behaviorally, I could walk that out. And that's why my anchors are largely measured by those 4 pillars, right? It's sleep, exercise, nutrition, where I either slept or I didn't. I either exercised or I didn't. I either ate well or I ate fast food because I hate myself. And then relational connectedness, like that. I either played with my kids this week or I didn't. I either went to Jump World with my 4-year-old or I didn't. I either called my best friend on the phone this week or I didn't. And so maybe that's, I sometimes get, harassed at Notre Dame by international faculty as being a simple-minded, pragmatic American male. I can own that, I guess. But I think having it be measurable like that as markers of self-compassion, kindness, wisdom, and discipline in my life has been really essential for me. Because it's like, if I gave somebody that schedule, Britton, and I said, this is how many hours you're going to work. And also, you've had catastrophic and incalculable loss in the last year. And also, it's 70 degrees, but you don't even know it. How you doing? It's like, somebody's going to be like basically just flourishing, man. It's just all positive, baby. It's just amazing. It's like
the evidence says you're not doing that great.
Exactly.
And if you're doing okay, you're probably not going to be that way for long.
That's exactly right. And we draw overly So like there's this fascinating thing in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error. It's been around forever. It's basically this idea. It actually helps us understand prejudice and stereotypes. It basically is, on average, if something difficult happens in my life, like I show up to work late, for example, um, I can usually come up with a lot of environmental and circumstantial data points to help explain that. It's kind of like, well, the traffic and these other things were at play, and it's been very stressful, and whatever. If Frank, my coworker, shows up to work late, I don't really think a lot about environmental. I draw almost immediate dispositional factors. It's like, well, Frank was late because he's a recalcitrant moron. Like, he's just the kind of idiot that would always come in late. He's the worst. It's like, but when it's
Right.
us, it's usually like, oh, consider all these things, and I had to run my kid here, and there was these other things, and oh god, the weather, da 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 da. What I think is fascinating though about people with depression or anxiety is almost like the opposite of that happens, where they're more charitable and willing to consider complex explanatory factors for other people's mishaps or whatever, but they only draw very dispositional attributions about why they aren't doing very well or why their life isn't going very well. They become almost like myopic and self-preoccupied as the only framework from which they can make sense of things. Like, that's just because that's the kind of person I am, or I'm all bad. And I oftentimes just think like how helpful it can be as a psychologist. One of the gifts that I hope to offer is to like hold up a giant life-size mirror to someone after they've shared with me their story, to help them to see themselves in the various settings, relationships, circumstances, and contexts of their life, so that we can see the whole picture. To be like,
Right.
what if you have high levels of agitation, not because there's some, almost supernatural, gravitational, biblical number 4 pull on your life that's going to make you, end your life, but rather because you're a human being that needs more sleep and you've been really stressed out lately. And it's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I can't know that for a fact, but like, that's a hell of a hypothesis, right? And that's something that could actually be measured. And it's that space between stimulus and response where you say, and I need to exercise self-compassion in this way. I need to go to bed. I need to put my damn screen down and go to bed an hour for the next week and see how that goes. Or I'm not going to give up weed altogether because I'm still telling myself the story that I need it. It's good for me, but I could use a lot less of it, see what happens, and I, it's like, I can find the end in that and walk it in a self-compassionate behavioral way.
Yeah. One of the things I do know about, especially like depressive people and the things that they use to avoid or mask or whatever, is those things are generally some sort of intoxication method, and so that's automatic sleep deprivation right there. The two things: sleep deprivation, but it also doesn't allow you to lean into who you are and what's going on in your life. And so, which in turn, I mean, it's just a snowball effect of, well, then those two things happen, then you're groggy the next morning, and you just don't have motivation. So that reoccurs almost daily. And there becomes very few days where energy is part of your life. And it's
that's where it's like, I'm no longer the victim of this circumstance, at least in part. I'm the architect of it. Like the solutions that I have sought, no matter how innocent or naive or actually aspirational in a positive way they might have been initially, have provided to me such diminished returns and actually catastrophic, consequences. And yet I've continued to do them. And I've had people literally tell me they wanted to like assault me in a therapy room. And like, I guess you get that when you're working with Marines and whatever. Sometimes these guys like part of their identity. But like when you reflect that, That it's like, what if you're having a pretty normal response to a circumstance where you're constantly sabotaging your own opportunities to flourish? And it's like, hey, bro, I didn't come here for you to reflect that kind of thing. I came here for you to be like, oh,
Yeah.
poor
Yeah.
guy. And it's like, but that, I mean, I would rather, right, hopefully with compassion and accurate empathy and understanding, reflect back like, where can we find how your agency has walked you off a cliff of despair? And how could we sort of re-navigate that agency or volitionality in the direction of something that actually matters to you, so that
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that we stop this like pattern.
Yep. Yep. Well, and, one of the things we talked about earlier is, and that's kind of the point of this podcast, is to try to build some semblance of a community that is
Yeah,
available to people
yeah,
that, and one of my thoughts was, and maybe it's a bad thought, is people who have experienced suicide in
well,
their life with family members, friends, whatever. I think those are prime candidates to be the people that can be the most compassionate towards people like me.
yeah,
The problem is that you don't know where they're at in their suffering and their loss and their
um,
recovery and how it's going to trigger them. But I think they're probably one of the most prime communities to help, or at least try to walk beside
yeah,
people like me, because they have an understanding that most people do not have
yeah,
once they've processed
yeah,
why their loved one has
yeah.
taken their life.
I had a strange, a strange career in the U.S. Air Force as a psychologist, because I literally lived on the same base with many of the people that I provided services to. Or like when I deployed,
Mm. Yeah.
I might be in a group shower, butt naked, and turn around and one of my patients is also in there totally naked. And they're like, yo, what's up, doc? Dude, it's like, your erection, apparently. What is going on? What is going on? Whoa, this is really uncomfortable. Like, I didn't take any classes on this in grad school. But, if I could share something
Right.
personal with you, like, one of the cases that I don't know how many thousands of people I've been entrusted with working with at least one time as a mental health professional. But there was a case of, you know, a man who, I'll give almost no details about so that it's impossible to have ever identified him. But there's an individual who placed themselves in a very high risk potential for suicide, on the basis of gender and also psychiatric conditions. So people with gender dysphoria tend to be in a pretty high risk category for individuals that might attempt to end their life. And this gender dysphoria was the reason that services had started, and it caused, as you might imagine, enormous ruptures, long attachments to family and to
Yeah.
children. And eventually, this person ended their life by suicide. And in the military, there's these sort of like death notification processes whereby a leader in a unit, and typically someone from the God Squad, like one of these all faiths chaplains, and sometimes like a healthcare professional like myself, will go to a home to give like the notification that a service member has passed away. And so I happened to be on one of those, and uh, like there were fairly young kids at that house when we arrived. And in the Department of Defense, there's everything. Like, I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense, and I'm no longer
Right. Right.
but there's customs and courtesies and rules for how you dress and what you say and what you definitely don't say. You're not really encouraged to go over there and like start hugging people like at the taco stand. It's very formal. And like the level of human suffering that came out audibly out of those children was something, Britton, that I will never forget. And I've stayed in touch with that family. In fact, I hear from them at least 3 times a year. I hear from them every year on Christmas, every year on his birthday, and every year on the anniversary that occurred. And we're talking
Wow.
it's been at least, it's been years now. And if anyone would suspect, right, that that kind of incalculable grief and trauma is just totally dissipated away, not even close. And I've oftentimes thought, I wish, I was proximate to that case, and I knew what a burden he thought he was to his family. And I knew how some of his choices really hurt them. I knew how financial and extramarital and violence and all that, I knew how he was about 10 standard deviations away from what he would have wanted to be in terms of being a part of a family, or what he had initially committed to them. I know that. And I also know that that was he was the only parent that they were ever going to have in his role. And I guess sometimes when I've worked with individuals in the years since that who've really thought, from Joyner's model, suicide is not pursued selfishly. In the mind of most people who die by suicide, they really are convinced that everyone in the world, and even the people that matter the most, would be better off. I've sometimes
Absolutely.
that I could have those individuals on a body cam with me when we went over to that house, and that they could actually respond to these text messages 3 times a year to this family, who, despite all the pain and all the rupture, and in the end, this person was using male pronouns, but all the confusion that caused for the family, and despite all of that, the one thing that all of them would want was that this human being was still around. And I've oftentimes just wished, in terms of perspective taking, not perspective within a person's life, but just perspective in terms of someone who really made a lot of mistakes, so had a lot of internal turmoil, and yet who's desperately messed because of a deep source of love, and whose untimely end still strikes so many as both unnecessary, certain, undesired, and so I think the kind of human connection that you articulated, right? Families who've lost someone as a result of something like this is one form of human connection. And yet I think there's so many forms of human connection that end up being like in my discipline, where the malady is also where you find the cure. The worst traumas in the whole world are interpersonal. But you could have a trauma from a hurricane or a tornado, but you're very unlikely to get PTSD from that. A sexual assault, you're way more likely to get PTSD. And if thwarted belongingness is a huge precursor to an intense desire to end one's life, if I perceive myself as a burden relationally to others, then there's got to be interpersonal, between person factors that end up being so protective. And one of the things that immediately comes to my mind about that is that some of the worst cases of depression I've ever been proximate to have been remedied in terms of the work that I do with people. I don't prescribe medicine or do transcranial magnetic, stuff, or but in terms of cognitive behavioral acceptance, commitment, that kind of approach, putting myself in the good service of others right? So it's not about like finding someone who thinks I'm important, but making myself a worthwhile contributor in the life of someone else does about as much for somebody as anything that I could ever ask them to do in terms of their changing their
Yeah.
own thinking. That's what your
Yeah.
podcast is, man. I mean, I
Well, and
hope
that's
that
what,
you did.
that's what AA teaches also,
Yep,
is
that's exactly
you
right.
serve other people to
That's
get rid
exactly
of
right.
your
That's exactly right.
addiction, basically.
And what if
Um,
your addiction is like ruminative thoughts of self-harm? Or like what if your
yeah,
compulsive thing is, like I gotta wash my hands. Like
right.
I got it's like what if I've just like this becomes such a freaking habit that it feels like a fact, but it's not. And what if the
So,
cure isn't like I'm doing that loop in my head all the time, but like carrying that with me in the direction of something purposive that benefits something bigger than myself, and finding that my life matters in light of that.
see, most people think purpose comes out of what we do.
Yeah.
Like, how am I getting, what's my career? That's purpose.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not, like, for me, I haven't really contributed much to the world as far as like work habits.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't have a lot of money. So therefore my worth is not as much as somebody else's. That's a very common thought, especially even for me. It's like, I'm not doing anything.
Well,
So
yeah.
what good am I?
Yep.
And then I've done these bad things, and I've pushed these people away and pissed these people off. So what good am I?
Yeah.
Was a very real thought. But here's what I would challenge people, and you probably don't know this. I don't know that we talked about this. Maybe you did. Maybe I did. I forget a little bit. I'm
Yeah.
again working a lot. But one of the reasons this podcast started was because I started telling my friends what I was going to do in order to give them an opportunity to say goodbye.
Yep.
What I realized is those 3 friends that I had turned into 20,
Mm.
and those 20 are some of my closest friends that I didn't even, and out of this journey, I've built like foundations, solid foundations out of just even interviewing people and being in proximity of their own suffering.
Yeah.
And that that's the that's the beautiful part for me. But I'll tell you what if you're thinking about suicide, go tell your people.
Well,
You're going to get rejected in some areas. You're going to be told you're going to go to hell. You're going to be told that you're not going to be loved by God. But the people that will love you and accept you will blossom. Those people that don't, that can't handle your journey, that don't know how to navigate it, and it's maybe not handle, but they don't know how to navigate that because it's not part of their narrative
no.
or something they understand, they'll peel away.
Yep.
The nice thing is they don't, like I lost those 8 friendships this last year, but like I lost 12 years, 30 years, 5 years. The thing is even through that loss, those that doesn't negate the last 12 years, the last 30 years, the last 5 years. So that one event, this one little event that broke us apart, it may be fragile, but it doesn't define the last so many years of that relationship. And that's helped me take the resentment out of it. So, I mean, it's huge, but you're going to get rejected if you tell people you're going to commit suicide. There's no doubt about it. But there are going to be people that will stand up that you never thought would stand beside you. And they'll become your close people.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, like, what a great example of truly fulfilled will you be when you recognize how spiritually bankrupt you are, or just like how empty you are inside, and where you go with that really matters. So it's like, don't delude yourself in, avoiding the pain and the bankruptcy of what's going on. Don't put on a bunch of masks to try to convince everybody that things are a lot better than they actually are. Carry that brokenness into something restorative and connected. And really the psychological literature on this would say that carrying that to some vertical dimension as well as some horizontal dimension with friends, or deep friends, or people in our lives is about as close to flourishing as human beings can get. Like if I can be rightly oriented with some kind of a higher power, and I can also share my life as a co-sufferer co, bastardized version of whatever a perfect human would be with other people, then, I get to go a lot farther in this life. And I get to build a life that's actually worth being with, instead of having a life that I'm just constantly looking to try to escape from. And that, I think, sadly, for most of the people listening to your podcast, living in these times, like with some of the things we've talked about related to how easy it is to be addicted to things and to have pervasive patterns of avoidance in our life, most of the people listening to your podcast currently are situated in a life that they just are looking for the next opportunity to escape from.
Yes.
And there's something about turning towards what's here without all that avoidance stuff, and hopefully also towards connection vertically and or horizontally, that like opens us up to be able to not only feel fully, but also like pivot freely in the direction of building a meaningful life, like one that's worth having just as it is.
Yeah. I love that word pivot.
Yeah.
Because like I don't pivot very well from my thought process. And that's what I was telling you in the beginning of this is I don't, that's, it's good for people to have the Easter eggs to learn how to pivot.
Yeah.
And those Easter eggs allow you to do that a little bit at a time
Yeah.
to where then it becomes habit. And that's what I love about that. That's what I love about doing something like this. Because it is the little things that will change somebody's trajectory or perspective. It's not all the this has all been great information, but you're not going to retain all that good information. But you will retain those little things that allow you to pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful thing to latch onto. But
Yeah.
well, let me ask you this: we're 2:20 in now, so do you have any closing suggestions, words, advice? Advice might be a little I don't know if advice is a good one, but because of your profession, you can't really do that outside of. But any closing words that you would love to share with people?
Yeah, I would share a couple of those pivots, if you don't mind. Like one of them,
No, absolutely.
One of the things that's been pretty impactful for me personally and professionally is when it comes to really painful negative thoughts and emotions, we're using a lot of energy there. Like we ruminate, we feel really intensely. You can sense it in your body. Even if somebody was watching you in an agitated or really dysphoric state, it's obvious. Redirecting that energy is what the pivot is all about. It's like, instead of stewing it, one of the easiest ways to approach that, I think, is, if mindfulness is about recognizing something that's here, like being able to say out loud, like, I'm telling myself the story again, that having the thought again, that having the emotion again, that. And then the very next thing to pivot it is like, what does this tell me that I care about? I know I mentioned that earlier, but I think one of the things that I'm astounded by is, like, if people actually try this and they say it out loud, like hopefully not like in the middle of a work meeting and everyone starts thinking that they're responding to internal stimuli or whatever, but to literally say out loud, like, I am pissed as a hornet right now. And what does that tell me that I care about? Like, all of a sudden we're able to kind of separate ourselves as a thinker from a particular thought, or as a feeler from a particular feeling. And it's like, well, I'm angry because there's a goal that's been blocked. Like, I wanted something to be so and it wasn't. And that tells me that I care about blah, 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 blah. But it's like, if I can drill down to the conviction, then the next thing that I do say or be about can come from that. And that's how I build a meaningful life. If I just stay up in the emotion, then the next thing that I do say or be about is going to be like reactionary and angry, or reactionary and scared, or reactionary and sad. And another thing is, like, these jars on my back wall.
Yeah, talk about those a little bit. Yeah,
are about 10 years worth of gratitude jars. and in my family, we'll get a mason jar at the beginning of each year, sit it in a prominent place in our home, cut up a bunch of little slips of paper. I guarantee, Britain, that today I'll put the date on. I'll say that I spent some time with you on this podcast. I'll fold that up and I'll stick it in there. At the end of the year, it's a cool thing to dump it out and to take inventory of how the year went. And but I'll tell you another thing, like in terms of seeing myself in context, a lot of people have something approximating a shoebox or a special little container that has notes or cards or little symbols or something like that that they've collected throughout their life. Not everybody, but most people have something like that, digital or real. On a really difficult day, for me to be able to go to something like that from 8, 9, 10 years ago and spill the contents on the floor, like no matter how deep the darkness might be that I'm facing on that day, it also forces me to remember that in the timeline of my story, there have been people and processes and things and opportunities and blessings that I've not thought of maybe for 9 or 10 years that are also true about my life. So it's not about, you know, undoing something or not seeing something or immediately changing something that's difficult, but it's about like seeing that broader context. And the science of gratitude is replete with people who practice gratitude and regularly pivot towards it in a personal way like that, or even once a week, once a month, once a quarter, writing a letter of gratitude to someone, reading it to them and giving it to them. Like Laurie Santos at Yale has written and done research on that. It's just profound. Like it ends up that gratitude letter type thing is so emotional and so impactful that it ends up being like on the highlight reel for the year or even for someone's life to receive a letter like that.
Wow.
The other thing that I would say is that there are going to be some aspects of our life that are bitterly salty. You know, if you think about like a cup that just has a ton of salt content in it, and a lot of times people will come to a psychologist and they're like, I got to get this freaking salt out of here. And I'm, you know, I paid my $10 copay to come talk to you because I assume you've got a pair of tweezers, bro, and you can just start plucking them out of there. And it's like, I'm terribly sorry, but no such tweezers exist. Like the salt's in there. And I think one of the things that becomes really important for us as humans is not so much that we need the salt to get out of there, but that we need to search for freshwater experiences to bring in so that we can dilute that a little bit. And the freshwater usually comes in terms of accomplishments and meaning and purpose and positive emotions and definitely relationships. That's basically Seligman's model for human flourishing. It's like if I'm feeling particularly worn out or something in my life is particularly salty, how can I pivot towards a freshwater experience? Not to make that go away. I don't need that to go away. I can have that exactly as it is, and I still get to have some freshwater stuff that keeps me going.
Yeah.
And then the final thing, Britton, that I would say for whatever it's worth is in my own personal experience as a kid that grew up being molested and tried to bringing that brokenness with me through adolescence and into a pretty dysfunctional sexual relationship with my wife. And it certainly set me off on a course to try to help other people. But I would also say that in recognizing my own kind of bankruptcy and need of something beyond myself to rehabilitate wounds that I wasn't even initially the cause of, but I was left with, it definitely set me in the direction of the Judeo-Christian worldview. At least in part because of how distinctive Christianity is in terms of a God who is also suffering. And I know that, you know, we're at the end of a podcast,
Good point.
but I think of like Edward Shalito's words in his poem. I think it's titled Jesus of the Scars. You know, so like I was just transfixed by this idea as an undergrad. I was not particularly religious. and I had still not really told anyone the full story of my childhood sexual abuse experience. I had not gone to see a counselor yet. I had drug a knife over my wrist in front of my girlfriend in some sort of suicidal gesture because I was so terrified she was going to leave me. I was a totally broken, very messy, very deeply insecure, terrified person. And yet I was so transfixed with this idea that there was a God who had also experienced like human suffering in terms of physical pain and betrayal and injustice and even death. And Edward Shalito's poem was something I bumped into that, it's like sometimes art, music, poetry, it's more instructive than instructions could ever hope to be, and in one stanza of the poem, Shalito is praying to God, and he says, "The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak." He's praying to Christ. "They rode, but thou didst stumble to your throne. But to our wounds, only your wounds can speak, for no other God has wounds but thou alone."
Wow. That's good.
And then I started reading through church history of all of these people who suffered like physical illnesses well before there were any kind of medicinal remedies, horrific injustices, persecution on the basis of their race, their gender, their religious predilections. And they also were transfixed by this idea, like he suffered, and so I can suffer well too. He overcame suffering, not by going over it, like might be customary in something like Islam, but by going through it. And therefore, he is the one who can relate to us. And I gave my life to him. And so, I think like Corrie ten Boom is one of these exemplars in human history who did some unbelievably courageous things inspired by her faith. And someone asked her one time, "How was it that you did this?" She actually rescued a bunch of Jewish people from discovery by the Nazis, which of course would have gotten her a brutal death. And, she saved a lot of people and wasn't caught. And later on, people had like, "Why would you do this for so many strangers? Like, why would you risk so much?" And her response was simple but profound when she said, "I just wanted to be the donkey upon which Jesus rode into the lives of other people." And I thought, like, for a woman to say, like, "I just wanted to be the ass upon which
right.
Jesus," and listen, like some of your listeners, like Jesus, put on top of the donkey hope, put on top of the donkey love, put on top of the donkey truth, put on top of the It's like, Britton, I think, like, in closing, man, like, I hope that when it matters most, you're able to connect with the same desire to live that you have for other people, for yourself, and that you continue to take up this lonely but deeply important work of being the donkey upon which vulnerability and truth and help seeking and inspiration. Final thing.
That's the nicest way I've ever been called an ass. That's for
That's
sure.
exactly right, man. Keep me in the ass, man. Keep me in the ass that's carrying this in, right? Such that it doesn't have to be about you. Like, you get to be, this is the only way I'm still doing this work. Like, people find out that I'll spend 8, 9, 10 hours in a row in therapy at Notre Dame, and they're like, "Why haven't you killed yourself? Like, what are you doing?" And it's like, it's not my job to heal people. Like, I'm a wounded healer because I follow the one who is ultimately the wounded healer. Like, I am the donkey upon which any kind of grace in its manifold forms might sprinkle into the life of someone, but I'm not personally responsible for fixing somebody. I can't do that, and frankly, I'm not even able to do that for myself. And so final thing, St. Augustine uh, has a prayer, and I'm not going to remember it all, but there are lines from it that I always prayed when I would go to these military units after a suicide or after they lost somebody, or God, one of the worst days was after a service dog was killed. That was so sad, to see how shaken up the handlers were when I just went to meet with them. But anyway, life is a precious freaking thing, and we're all shocked by the fact that we die, even though it's the only thing that could really accurately be predicted about all of us. I think that's why the book of Ecclesiastes says that God wrote eternity into the framework of the human heart. Like, it's almost an apologetic. Like, we're so shocked that it's like, I just talked to him. It's like, well, everybody dies. What were you thinking? But we are truly shocked by it because I don't think we were built for it initially, and therefore it's hard to reconcile. And
that's fair.
And I think that's at least in part why some people come across in less than helpful ways when we disclose. Like, sometimes I think about staring down my own life instinct. Like, it freaks people out. They don't know what to say, and they engage in their own kind of wounded, self-serving response styles and that sort of thing. Like, I'm glad that you shared that, because people might respond poorly, but it shouldn't be a detriment to you continuing to reach out for connection, even if it takes the third person, saying it too. The St. Augustine wrote this prayer, and sometimes when I'd go out to talk to these guys, I wouldn't know what to say, but there's lines in it. I think the poem's called God of Our Life. And I've tried to sprinkle some of those things in our talk today, because it's like very little of what I had to say was probably very useful, but maybe one of these resources could be, it's like somebody's like, oh, I really like that poem, or I really liked, that book or that idea. And God of Our Life is something like, God of our life, there are days when the burdens we carry chafe our shoulders and weigh us down, and when the skies are dark and threatening, and when our hearts have no music in them. And then there's this amazing turn in the prayer, and he asks God, like, flood the path with light, and tune our hearts to brave music, and set our eyes on the skies where there's light and they're full of promise. And give us a sense of comradeship with saints and comrades from every age. And man, that's my hope for you in this, right? That for you and for those that listen, that the heart would be tuned to brave music, that the path would be flooded with light, so that we could see the whole damn thing and not just what's painful. And that we could have a sense of comradeship with people from every age, because this has been an age-old dilemma. Why not suicide? And yet we would also be able to walk in a direction together to be able to contribute to something with every breath and beat the heart that we have. So thanks for having me on, man. It was a real privilege to spend time with you. I hope we keep in touch.
Yeah. This was great. I mean, this has been a pleasure for me, and this is going to be, again, we're back to those Easter eggs. There's 100 of them in this conversation for somebody that is looking for an avenue to pivot. So really appreciate you being here. And hopefully we'll get to do this again.
Yeah.
if you're up for it. But
keep in touch with me. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, I will.
All right.
I will. Thank you so much.